In this video I'll be adding insulated plasterboard to this single skin block wall and boxing in the windows, and the first job was to take some measurements and draw up a quick diagram so that I can cut the first board to size. I was hoping that I could do the whole wall with just 2 boards, which is going to be very tight to be honest, but this stuff isn't cheap to buy, so I didn't want to buy a third board if I could avoid it. I'm using a straight edge to score the paper on the plasterboard, and I keep scoring it as deep as possible until I can finally snap the board. The insulation boards that I'm going to be using are called Gyproc Thermaline Plus, which consists of plasterboard mounted to a polystyrene insulant. And this stuff is different to the stuff I've used in the past. The stuff I used previously had a really thin foil layer between the plasterboard and the insulation to act as a vapor barrier. This stuff doesn't have that. Apparently the closed cell structure of this foam acts as an integral vapor barrier in itself. So that layer of foil apparently isn't needed. And this material is only 27mm thick, which means it isn't going to be drastically reducing the size of the room when it's applied to the walls. It's probably important that I point out now that retaining heat in this room isn't really the main objective for us here. I mean, the insulation will help with that obviously, but our aim isn't to make these spaces toasty and warm. We are installing the boards purely just to resolve any future issues with mold and condensation. This storeroom is just a storage space and it's not a living space for us. So just to give you a quick bit of background, 3 years ago we moved in here and the external walls of this storeroom had no cavity and therefore no insulation. So when we moved in, they were covered in mould and mildew. So we cleaned them all up and started insulating the walls, but I never got around to insulating the final wall, which I'm going to be doing in this video. So it's in with the first board just to see if it fits, and that looks pretty good. You'll see that I allowed clearance of about 15mm at the bottom, and that's just to ensure that any moisture from the ground can't be transferred to the plasterboard. Speaking of moisture on the floor, you might be wondering what that black paint is. It's a damp-proof membrane that I applied in a previous video. I'll leave a link to that along with some other videos about damp, humidity and mould in the description box below. And the DPM should ensure that damp cannot transfer through to the inside through the floor, where we've previously had issues with mould growth. The reason for the moisture issue here is that the damp-proof course level has been compromised by this concrete floor being installed too high, so moisture is breaching the DPC, and I will be taking steps to resolve this soon by cutting away a channel in the concrete. I used some glazing packers just to lift the board and create an air gap at the bottom, and then I set up a laser level to make sure that the first board goes in nice and straight. You'll see here that the floor isn't flat at all, so I added more packers on one side until it was sitting level. I've got this copper pipe that needs to be cut around, so I mark that up and make a cut with the knife so that I can seat the board against the wall. Then I can get the board moved out of the way because I'm going to use the laser level again, this time to help me mark up the position of the windows. So first I'm moving the crosshair to the top right corner of the window. I can then pop the board back in place and mark up the corner with a pencil. And I also mark some level lines to give me an outline for the window. And then I move the board back again, position the crosshair in the opposite corner and repeat. Once I have the opening marked out, I can start cutting, and for that I'm going to use my multi-tool, which is just going to help speed things up as I can cut all the way through both the plasterboard and the insulation with this. I also need to make cutouts for these air vents, but those cutouts don't need to be quite so accurate. So for these, I'm just going to get the vents removed.
Oh my god.
And then measure up from the wall and the floor and make the cutouts based on those dimensions. Okay, so time to get the first board fitted, and I've bought some of this Sudal plasterboard foam adhesive, which is what I used previously and it worked well, so I thought I'd stick with it. Pardon the pun. I forgot that the first squeeze of the trigger often misfires. Oops. Anyway, it's important to get a full bead around the perimeter to prevent cold bridging, which I'll talk a bit more about later in this video. And I also need to do that around each opening, and then I do zigzags in the middle. And you have to wait about 5 minutes for the adhesive to go tacky. You can test it with your finger, and once you get mozzarella cheese-like stringy bits, it's good to go. I managed to get a bit on the ceiling as I lifted the board in place. I'll clean that up later. And I just want to make sure it's in the right position and then press it firmly against the wall. And then I used a long spirit level just to make sure it's all sitting true. And then it's on to the next board, and I used all the same tricks again. The laser level to help me mark up the position of the window openings so that they are perfectly level with each other, and the second board goes on nicely. I mentioned earlier that I was hoping to get the whole wall done with 2 boards, and I have the offcuts here, so let's see if my calculations were right. And yes, it looks like I'll just get away with it. These plasterboards have a tapered edge down each of the long edges, which allows space for taping and jointing, and that's really useful. But because I'm being so efficient with materials here, unfortunately I won't be able to make full use of that tapered edge, as the long edges on these offcuts are not tapered. It's important to get a nice tight fit between boards, again to prevent cold bridging. And I need to make sure that the boards are flush with those that are already fitted. I used the rest of my spray foam to seal up the edges, and once dry it cuts away pretty clean. I like to use the mesh style scrim tape for taping and jointing. I never really got on well with the paper tape stuff, whereas this has a mild adhesive so it holds itself in place, and it'll help to prevent any cracking in the plaster, or the filler in this case, as I'm going to be using a product called Easy Fill, which I've had a lot of experience using in the past. It seems to be getting more and more expensive recently though, unfortunately, but it's easy to work with and it sands easily too, which is good because I'm no plasterer. I get it pushed into the joints with a filler knife and then finish off with my trowel to get it evened out. And this first coat doesn't need to be perfect, really I just want to make sure that the filler is all worked into that scrim tape. And the corner of the wall gets the same treatment. While I'm waiting for the first coat to dry, I thought I'd have a go at painting these UPVC windows as I hate the colour of them. I gave them a thorough cleaning with a chemical cleaner, and then I start masking the glazing with some tape. And I need to prime the surface with a couple of coats of this Zinsser Bin 123 paint. It's a shellac based paint so it adheres well to most surfaces, UPVC included, and it dries really quickly too. So quickly, in fact, that after only an hour, I was applying a top coat of some water-based satin finish white paint. Now onto the second coat of filler, and this is where I can work on getting the surface smooth and flat. And in the corner where the old Pebble Dash render is, I fill the gap with a big bead of decorator's caulk. This is probably going to crack as it does have a tendency to shrink a bit, but I can always reapply as necessary to fill any voids. I'm going to start working on boxing in the windows next, and I have some 9mm MDF I can use for this. Moisture resistant MDF would be a better choice around a window, but my windows don't open, so I don't think moisture will be a problem here, although more on that later. I start by ripping some pieces to fill the depth of the window opening, and I cut some pieces to length to form a simple box that will fit inside the opening. I can assemble that just with glued butt joints and brad nails. I make sure it's square, and then I can rip some more of the MDF to form a mitered frame that I can secure to the front edges of the box. And they get glued and pinned in place too. Once the glue is dry, I get all the exterior faces and edges sanded, and I can check how it fits. Unfortunately, the windows are out of alignment with the walls, so I measure the offset at each corner and mark up in millimeters how much material needs to be removed from the back. You'll see here that this piece is 14mm off at one corner, tapering down to almost nothing on the other side, and I need to make these adjustments on all 4 edges. And then I can follow the line with my circular saw to trim away the excess. Then I get a coat of primer on, and before fitting the window boxes I'm going to add some PVC angle bead to hide the transition between ceiling and wall, and I'm using a grab adhesive to fix it in place. And I'll also use that to fit the window boxes as well. On the other side I had to notch it out to get it to fit to allow for the slope of the ceiling. Then I fill the nail holes and caulk the edges, and I'll get a top coat of paint on this later. So this has now had 2 coats of filler, and I think everything is looking nice and smooth now. It does look a little bit of a mess, and that's because I used 2 different types of filler. I ran out of easy fill, and then I went and got some of the no-nonsense stuff, which I'm actually pretty impressed with. It works quite well. Now I'm just going to do a little bit of hand sanding, and then I can finally decorate the wall. I'm using some contract matte white for this, so it's on to cutting in and then rollering. 3 coats in total. And I used some white satin as a top coat on the window boxes just to make them a bit more durable. And finally, I have some nice new vents to fit. Right, so that's the wall insulated, but I do want to talk quickly about a mistake that I made. I mentioned cold bridging or thermal bridging a few times earlier in the video, and that can occur basically where there is a gap between insulation. So as an example, if we take the gaps in between 2 insulation boards, say there was a gap of a few millimeters, basically humid air in the room can pass through plaster or filler and condense on the cold wall behind it, as there's no insulation there to keep the wall warm, and that could lead to mold growth. Another example of this might be if you cut out some of the insulation to install some pattress boxes ready to fit some power sockets, for example. Now, while I don't have any large gaps between boards or power sockets, I probably should have thought a bit more about my window openings, because it probably would have made more sense to insulate inside the openings prior to adding the insulation boards to the wall. And that's because the area around the windows is a common cold area where condensation could form. Will what I did be okay? I don't know, but I'll definitely be keeping an eye on it. If you want to learn more about this stuff, I'd highly recommend a video by my friend Charlie D.I. White. He has a video about installing insulated plasterboard on his channel, but he actually uses the dot and dab method rather than the foam type adhesive that I used. Charlie goes a bit deeper into the detail behind it all, and I think he admits himself that he made a few mistakes as well, but dealing with moisture isn't straightforward. I think Charlie describes it himself as being a bit of a dark art, and I would definitely agree. And it would be easy enough to just say it's best to get the professionals in. I'm sure some people will be even writing that in the comments. But in my past experiences, that's not always a route to success. I've had more bad experiences of hiring tradesmen over the years than good, unfortunately, where things haven't been done right and problems have arisen further down the line. Don't get me wrong, if you manage to find a real expert on this stuff who's been dealing with these types of issues for many years, then chances are they might do a better job than you could do yourself. But personally, my preference is to try and learn about this stuff myself through doing it myself, and then if things go wrong later down the line, I'll be able to learn from my mistakes and find a way to put it right. And I can assure you that if things go wrong here, I'll let you know about it too, and I'll show you what I do to rectify it. Thank you for watching.